Honorable Prime Minister Borisov, Honorable Commissioner Andor, Honorable President Tsacheva, Honorable Minister Donchev, Honorable Mayor Fandakova. Please let me express my gratitude for the invitation and the possibility to share my thoughts with you on how the EU funds can contribute to the social inclusion of Roma in relation to the European Roma strategy. In March 2011, the European Parliament was first to present its ideas and recommendations concerning the poverty and social exclusion affecting the majority of European Roma in its report on the EU strategy on Roma inclusion that I had the opportunity to be the rapporteur of. As a result of an agreement spanning through 6 political groups of 27 member states and 5 committees, the overwhelming majority of the European Parliament supported the document and thus presented several progressive recommendations and a strong political message to the Commission, the Council and the Member States. Building on the belief that the socio-economic inclusion of Roma is possible, desirable and above all necessary for our future, and that there would be a substantial added value from the involvement of the EU in such a long-term initiative, the basic aim of the report was to propose a strategic framework in which, as member states come together to cooperate on specific measures, the general oversight would be within the community structures, with periodic reports and recommendations. Therefore, the report calls for the adoption of a place-based and inclusive action plan that is prepared and implemented on a multi-level basis that is indicative, inclusive and able to evolve as needed, and where the crucial responsibilities are placed at the level most appropriate, usually as low as possible, rather than Brussels taking over. The document also proclaims the basic principles that the stakeholders of the strategy must deal with. Most importantly, the report proposes to base the inclusion strategy on socio-economic factors instead of focusing on ethnicity, since even if ethnicity-based discrimination could be eliminated before now, the marginalization of Roma will still remain, given the multiplicity of interconnected factors generating it and the persistent presence of variety of physical barriers also. The document therefore argues that although anti-discrimination and fighting racism are indispensable, such measures by themselves are not enough to overcome the historic lag of Roma, and there is an urgent need for complex and holistic development programs with a cross-sector integrated approach that allow for intermediate intervention. Beside the definition of the target audience, the principle of territorial targeting is also a key concept of the report. The geographic distribution of social disadvantages is not uniform throughout the member states, but poverty and social exclusion is concentrated in underdeveloped micro-regions, which in many member states are predominantly inhabited by Roma. This aspect of exclusion is currently statistically invisible, since the scope of analysis, decision-making and planning is too wide to locate these crisis spots emerging in peripheral intra-regional areas or in lagging behind micro-regions. The report, in accordance with the policy recommendations of the Hungarian presidency, calls for the establishment of an all-European crisis map to identify and measure these micro-regions by their distinctive statistical attributes based on common, comparable and reliable indicators, and the European Parliament also pioneered in calling for the introduction of an enlargement dimension, enabling the EU to involve candidate countries and potential candidates from the very first stage. On the 5th of April, the European Commission launched its communication on the European Framework of National Roma Inclusion Strategies, and the Council of Employment, Social Policy, Health and Consumer Affairs adopted the conclusions of the Hungarian presidency on the issue on the 19th of April. Both documents mostly take on board the above described principles and also adopt several of the European Parliament's specific recommendations. The appointment of a national contact points for the national strategies, the simplification of funding procedures and putting in place a robust monitoring system, with clear benchmarks to ensure that the tangible results are measured. The European Commission also undertakes the task of assessing national action plans right after the submission and reporting annually on the progress of integration and the achievements of the goals. So it seems that the Commission is ready to play a leading role in the strategic coordination of the key delivery stages. As for the funding of the strategy, It needs to be secured that the EU and the national funds can contribute to the substantial and enduring improvement of the life conditions of the Roma. In this regard, more target and development-oriented, complex, flexible and sustainable programs are necessary, with longer time coverage and greater territorial relevance, focusing on the most disadvantaged microregions and addressing suburban and rural poverty. In order to improve the astonishingly low rates of fund absorption, in particular concerning those specifically intended for marginalized groups, the effectiveness of consumption must be developed at all levels of financing. In this regard, my report presents several recommendations, from which I would like to present here 10 examples. First, benchmarks, indicators, as well as independent monitoring and impact assessment mechanism need to be developed to support and evaluate the efficiency and results of the programs, rather than purely checking that projects in respect of grants have met the procedural formalities. Second, Member States must implement the horizontal priority of marginalized communities within the framework of the EU structural funds. Third, agencies and organizations implementing projects co-financed by structural funds and targeting Roma directly or benefiting Roma indirectly must be held accountable and implement actions in a transparent manner. Fourth, an ongoing cost-benefit analysis on the proportion of funds dedicated to and spent on the actual programs and running expenses is also very necessary. Fifthly, the scope of EU funding must be extended so that besides development, also the provision of quality public services becomes eligible as well. Sixth, the rules of co-financing should be renewed and possibly differentiated to better reflect the diversity of actions and beneficiaries, and thus projects targeting Roma could be required to have a lesser share of co-financing from the country, with a higher share by the EU. Seventh, the coordination among related EU policies must be significantly improved in order to foster synergies and complementaries. Bureaucratic and implementation rules must be sustainably simplified, and all barriers between the various funds must be eliminated, so that the maximum possible allocation of resources can be achieved by all the instruments. 8. The use of structural funds must be combined with national and local approaches by acting through programs that concurrently operate with a national strategy and provide local responses to specific needs. Furthermore, synergy must be facilitated between the implementation of structural funds and governance strategies for Roma, as well as between the managing authorities of the European Social Fund and the specialized Roma units or coordination structures dealing with Roma issues. Ninth, the Commission must offer the necessary technical support to improve the administrative capacities of bodies involved in the administration of the structural fund, and the Member States must provide advice and administrative assistance, for example by organizing training and by helping with aid applications and explanations. Stakeholders must also find a way to make it easier for Roma to obtain information concerning European and national funding programs in support of entrepreneurship and employment, and to submit the relevant applications. Finally, I would like to reiterate one of the innovations of the European Parliament's report, namely the proposal that part of the cohesion budget should be set aside in the next multi-annual financial framework in performance reserve. It could provide vital resources and decisive incentives for implementation by allocating funds on a competitive basis defined by the criterion how the proposed project or the intervention supports and implements the objectives of the strategy. By introducing such an ex-post reward mechanism, on the one hand, we could depart from the general practice of large contributors maximizing their returns from the unabsorbed funds, and on the other hand, a direct link could be created between the allocation of the financing and the production of the results. From now on, it will be up to the Member States to make their pledges by adopting the strategy and to realize these goals under the scrutiny of the EU institutions. I sincerely hope that, according to the plans of the Hungarian government, the June 24th summit will bring a fruitful agreement, and the EU strategy aiming the social inclusion of Roma can be finally launched. However, the design of a new, more inclusive and a more prosperous Europe cannot be based solely on a law, but must be built through a broad and consistent partnership of all the stakeholders, who must engage themselves in a concentrated effort to overcome the historic exclusion of the continent's largest ethnic minority. For it, If the European dream fails, it's most vulnerable. It fails us all.